The theater lights dimmed and a hush settled over the small private screening room. Rain tapped lightly against the windows outside, as if even the sky was curious about what would unfold. Sandra Bullock sat quietly in the corner row, her fingers intertwined, her breath shallow. Beside her, Keanu Reeves leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen. They were here not as stars tonight, but as two people walking back into their own memories. Their new, limited series, a project that had taken 2 years of quiet dedication, was about to play for the first time in front of an audience. The seats were filled not with critics or studio executives, but with volunteers, nurses, teachers, and people whose lives had been touched by the real events that inspired the show. It wasn't a glamorous premiere. It wasn't supposed to be. 5 minutes before the screening began, Sandra had caught a glimpse of a woman sitting near the back. Her hands were trembling as she clutched a small photograph. Sandra didn't know her name, but she recognized the photo. It was of a real-life nurse whose kindness had sparked one of the series' most powerful episodes. Something about that moment tightened Sandra's chest. Keanu noticed her glance. "Are you okay?" he whispered. She nodded, but her voice was soft. "Just remembering." The opening scene of the series began with a hospital corridor bathed in sunlight. On the screen, two actors who looked eerily like their younger selves walked through the hall, carrying boxes of supplies. Laughter filled the speakers, but in the theater, silence hung heavy. As the first episode unfolded, Sandra felt herself slipping back into old wounds and quiet triumphs. Every line of dialogue seemed to carry a hidden weight. When the story reached a scene about a small-town fundraiser, she felt her throat tighten. She remembered standing with Keanu years ago at a similar event. No cameras, no reporters, just the two of them handing out food in the rain. They had promised each other that night that kindness would always matter more than headlines. A few rows ahead, a young teacher wiped her eyes. Keanu noticed, and for a brief moment, his usual calm expression cracked into something raw. An unspoken understanding that stories weren't just entertainment. They were bridges. Then came the first twist. A scene on the screen revealed an anonymous donation that had saved a struggling school. The crowd murmured. The teacher gasped. Keanu's heart pounded because he remembered. The script hadn't credited him, but he had been the one who gave that money quietly years ago. Sandra glanced at him and their eyes met, the secret hanging between them like fragile glass. 30 minutes in, tension tightened again. The series showed a character failing publicly, mocked for trying to help. In the theater, an uncomfortable silence followed. Sandra felt old insecurities return, memories of being misunderstood when she had tried to do something good but imperfect. She clenched her hands tighter, willing herself to stay present. Keanu shifted in his seat, sensing her unease. He remembered that night vividly. Sandra had called him in tears after reading cruel comments about a charity misstep. He had simply said, "Storms pass. Kindness stays." Those words were now written into the script, and hearing them spoken aloud again filled the room with a kind of quiet magic. Near the end of the episode, a small boy's drawing appeared on screen, a child's simple sketch of two people holding hands under a rainbow. Sandra inhaled sharply. She had kept the original drawing tucked in a box for years. That boy had once approached her after a disaster relief event, shyly handing her the picture and whispering, "You make people feel safe." As the credits rolled, the lights came up slightly, but no one moved. Tears glistened on faces across the room. The woman with the photograph now had it pressed to her chest, her shoulders shaking silently. Keanu stood slowly. "Thank you for watching," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the storm of emotions inside him. A young man in the front row raised his hand hesitantly. Did this all really happen?" Sandra stepped forward, her own voice gentle. Every moment was inspired by something real, by people who chose kindness when it was hard. The room was silent again, but it was the kind of silence filled with something powerful: respect, understanding, and awe. As the audience began to clap, Sandra felt something shift inside her. All the doubts, the late-night worries about whether telling these stories mattered began to fade. She glanced at Keanu. He was smiling now, Not a movie star's polished grin, but a quiet, humble smile that said everything without words. But just as she began to breathe easier, a low murmur spread through the crowd. Someone near the door gasped. Outside, through the tall theater windows, flashing lights cut through the night, a small ambulance had pulled up. The nurse with the photograph stood quickly, her face pale. Keanu and Sandra exchanged a look, concern, confusion, and an unspoken promise to act. In that instant, they weren't actors or public figures. They were two people ready to step forward again, just as they had years ago when the world seemed to need them most. The applause faded, replaced by whispers. The next few minutes would change everything, in ways no script could have predicted. The flashing lights outside the theater painted the wet pavement in streaks of red and blue. For a moment, the audience inside stayed frozen, their hands still halfway through applause, unsure of what had just interrupted their quiet reverence. Keanu Reeves was the first to move. He stepped quickly toward the door, his boots echoing against the polished floor. Sandra Bullock followed close behind, her heart thudding in her chest. When they stepped outside, the night air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. The ambulance sat at the curb, its engine humming softly. A paramedic was kneeling beside an older man who had collapsed just a few feet from the entrance. The nurse with the photograph, the one Sandra had noticed earlier, was already crouched at his side, her trembling hands pressed against his shoulder. Keanu dropped to a knee opposite her. "What happened?" he asked, his voice calm but urgent. He couldn't breathe," the nurse whispered, her eyes wide with fear. He was her husband. The nurse in this photo. He wanted to see this series because she's gone now. Her voice cracked on the last word. Sandra's throat tightened. She could see the faded photograph now, a younger woman in scrubs smiling gently at the camera. This was more than an emergency. This was a connection to the very heart of the story they had just told. The paramedics worked quickly, placing an oxygen mask over the man's face. The small crowd from the theater gathered near the windows, watching silently. No one reached for a phone to record. No one whispered gossip. The room that had been filled with applause moments ago was now filled with something heavier, shared concern. Keanu placed a steadying hand on the nurse's shoulder. "He's in good hands," he said quietly. "You're not alone." The nurse blinked back tears and nodded. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, Sandra felt a tug of responsibility she couldn't ignore. She turned to Keanu. "We should follow," she said softly. He didn't hesitate. "Of course." They slipped out quietly, leaving the charity volunteers to reassure the audience. Ana de Armas, who had been sitting quietly near the back during the screening, offered to stay behind and explain. "Go," she told them. "They need you." The drive to the hospital was silent except for the sound of the wipers swishing across the windshield. City lights blurred past, their reflections dancing on the wet asphalt. Sandra gripped the clay heart she had kept in her bag since the first day of filming, holding it tight as if it could guide her. Keanu glanced at her. "You're thinking about the series?" he asked gently. "I'm thinking about how real it all is," she replied. "We told their stories, and now here we are, part of another one." At the hospital, the smell of antiseptic filled the air. Fluorescent lights buzzed quietly above them. The nurse sat alone in a plastic chair in the waiting area, her hands clasped so tightly they were turning pale. She looked up when she saw Sandra and Keanu. Her eyes widened, as if she couldn't quite believe they had come. "You didn't have to," she began. "We did," Sandra interrupted softly. "Your husband mattered to her. He matters to us." They sat with her in silence, offering the kind of presence that speaks louder than words. Minutes stretched into an hour. Sandra found herself remembering a night years ago, after another charity event, when she had broken down from exhaustion. Keanu had simply sat with her, no speeches, no advice, just a steady presence. Now she understood how much that had meant. When the doctor finally entered, his expression was calm. "He's stable," he said. "It was a scare, but he'll be okay." Relief washed over the nurse's face. She covered her mouth with her hands, tears spilling freely now. Keanu smiled gently. "Can we see him?" "Just for a minute," the doctor replied. They walked quietly into the room. The older man lay on the bed, pale but awake. When he saw the nurse, his lips curved into a faint smile. Then his gaze shifted to Sandra and Keanu. You told her story," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We tried to," Sandra said, her voice breaking. "We wanted people to know what she did." His eyes glistened. "She would have loved that." Keanu stepped closer, his tone humble. "She inspired us more than you'll ever know." The nurse reached for her husband's hand, and for a long moment, the room was filled with quiet gratitude. When they stepped back into the hallway, Sandra felt an ache in her chest, but this time it wasn't doubt or fear. It was awe. But the night wasn't done surprising them. As they walked toward the exit, a hospital volunteer stopped them. "Someone left this for you at the front desk," she said, holding out a small, rain-spotted envelope. Inside was a simple note written in careful handwriting. "You reminded us tonight that stories heal. Don't stop telling them." Keanu and Sandra exchanged a look, their eyes shining. On the way back to the theater, they passed a mural on a brick wall, a painting of two hands reaching for each other under a painted rainbow. Sandra slowed the car. "Look," she whispered. Keanu smiled faintly. "It's like the boys' drawing," she nodded, like a reminder. When they returned to the theater, many of the audience members were still there, waiting. As Sandra and Keanu entered, the room erupted in soft applause, not for celebrities, but for two people who had chosen to show up. The young teacher who had cried earlier stepped forward. "The series was beautiful," she said. "But tonight showed us who you really are." Keanu lowered his head slightly, humbled. "We're just people," he replied. "We're all in this together." Sandra felt the weight of the night settle into her heart, not as a burden, but as a promise. In a world often quick to judge and slow to care, this night had become something unforgettable. It wasn't the cameras or the scripts that mattered. It was the small, quiet choices to stand beside someone when it counted. As the audience began to leave, Sandra glanced at Keanu. "This isn't the ending people expect," she said softly. "Maybe it's better," he answered. The two of them stood side by side as the last of the guests filed out into the cool night air. Behind them, the empty screen still glowed faintly, as if holding the echoes of the stories it had just told, and the new one that had been written in its shadow. But even as the night quieted, Sandra sensed something stirring, another twist she couldn't yet name, a path neither of them could see, waiting just beyond the horizon. Morning lights spilled across the city, painting the streets with a golden glow that made puddles look like tiny pools of fire. Sandra Bullock sat by her window, a half-empty cup of tea in her hands. Sleep had been scarce, but her mind wasn't heavy with regret. It was alive with questions. The memory of the nurse's trembling hands, the husband's whispered gratitude, and the mysterious note at the hospital replayed again and again. It was as if the universe had chosen to remind her that stories never end when the credits roll. Keanu Reeves, meanwhile, was already on his motorcycle, the wind tugging at his jacket as he rode across the waking city. He wasn't heading to a studio or an interview. He was heading toward the old community center downtown, a place where they had once filmed a key scene for the series. The center's faded blue walls held years of laughter and tears. Today, he felt pulled there without knowing why. When he arrived, the doors were unlocked, and the smell of fresh paint filled the air. Inside, volunteers were repainting the walls, their voices cheerful. An elderly man with a cane recognized him and smiled. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "you two gave this place back its spirit. People believe in kindness again because of what you showed them." Keanu nodded humbly. "It wasn't just us," he replied. "It was all of you." At that very moment, Sandra's phone buzzed. It was a message from a journalist who had been at the screening. "People are talking about what you did last night." The hospital visit. The note. "They're calling it the night kindness came alive." She felt a rush of emotions, pride, fear, and something else she couldn't name. She decided to head to the community center, too, sensing that something important was waiting. When she arrived, she found Keanu sitting cross-legged on the stage, listening to a young woman speak. The woman's name was Elena. a teacher who had quietly raised funds for her students when no one else noticed. She held a small envelope. "This was found in the donation box this morning," Elena said, her voice shaking slightly. She handed it to Keanu and Sandra. Inside was another handwritten note. "You reminded us last night that storms can pass when hands join together. Go back to where the first story began." Sandra stared at the words. "Go back to where the first story began," she repeated. Keanu looked thoughtful. "The first story, the original charity event. Years ago, before the cameras and scripts, they had both shown up at a forgotten seaside village after a devastating flood. They had handed out blankets and food under a leaking tent. That was where they had met the boy who gave Sandra the drawing of the rainbow and two people holding hands. Without hesitation, they decided to return. The drive to the coast was long, the highway stretching endlessly under a sky streaked with clouds. Sandra felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Would the village even be the same? Would anyone remember? As they neared the coast, the scent of salt filled the air. The village looked different now. Repaired homes, fresh paint, small gardens blooming in front of doorways. But there was something familiar about the place, a quiet resilience that had survived the storms. Children played near the rebuilt school, their laughter carried on the wind. A few older villagers watched from their porches, their faces lighting up with recognition as Keanu and Sandra stepped out of the car. A woman in a green shawl approached them. "You came back," she said softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "We didn't think you would." "We never forgot," Sandra replied. The villagers gathered around. Someone brought out the old wooden sign that had once hung above the community hall, a sign Sandra and Keanu had helped paint after the flood. Its faded letters read, "Every drop matters." As they stood there, a small boy shyly stepped forward, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "My brother drew this for you," he said. Sandra unfolded the paper carefully. It was a new drawing, two people standing under a bright rainbow, their hands joined, but now a third figure stood beside them. Her heart tightened as she realized the boy had added himself. The villagers invited them inside for tea and bread. The room was simple but warm, the walls decorated with new murals, bright rainbows, clasped hands, and tiny houses painted in cheerful colors. One mural caught Sandra's eye. It showed a scene from the series, but in the corner someone had painted the words, "Stories Heal." As they sipped tea, an older man spoke. "Last night someone left food at every doorstep in the village. No one knows who did it. It was just kindness." Keanu glanced at Sandra, and a silent understanding passed between them. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about small, quiet actions that kept the world soft even when it hardened. But just as the moment felt serene, a sudden shout broke the calm. Outside, near the edge of the village, a group of teenagers were arguing. Their voices carried over the hills, sharp and tense. One of them, a tall boy in a torn jacket, threw a small rock toward the ocean, his anger spilling over. Sandra and Keanu exchanged a glance and rose from their seats. They walked toward the group, not with authority, but with quiet concern. As they approached, the teenagers fell silent, surprised. "What's going on?" Keanu asked gently. The tall boy looked down. "They're closing our art program," he muttered. "They say there's no money for it anymore." Sandra felt a familiar ache. She remembered being young, feeling like the world didn't care. She crouched to meet the boy's eyes. "Art saved my life once," she said softly. "And sometimes the world doesn't notice what's important until someone fights for it." Keanu nodded. "Maybe we can help." They didn't promise miracles. They didn't give speeches. Instead, they listened, truly listened, to the teenagers' worries. And in that moment, the quiet seeds of another story began to take root. As the sun set over the ocean, casting a warm orange glow across the village, Sandra felt a shift in her heart. Returning here wasn't just about revisiting the past, it was about stepping into the future. One small act of kindness at a time, she glanced at Keanu, who was standing beside the teenagers, showing them how to turn a fallen branch into a makeshift paintbrush. He looked up and caught her gaze. His small, knowing smile said everything. Storms pass, kindness stays. And just beyond the horizon, though they couldn't yet see it, another twist waited, a test of their resolve, a reminder that even the strongest bonds need care and courage to endure. The next morning, a pale mist hugged the coastline, turning the rebuilt village into something almost dreamlike. The waves were gentle now, whispering against the shore as if the ocean itself was catching its breath after years of storms. Sandra Bullock woke early, unable to shake a quiet unease that had followed her since last night. She stepped outside, the damp grass cool beneath her shoes, and watched the horizon turn pink. The drawing the little boy had given her rested in her jacket pocket. The crumpled paper, a fragile reminder of promises yet to be kept. Keanu Reeves was already awake, sitting on a weathered bench near the schoolyard. His motorcycle helmet rested beside him, but he hadn't started the engine. Instead, he was listening to the birds, the distant laughter of children, and the unspoken stories the village still carried. He looked up when he heard Sandra's footsteps. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked quietly. "Too many memories?" she replied, sitting beside him. The air between them felt both heavy and comforting. Before they could say more, the village elder approached, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She explained that a large development company was planning to buy land near the village to build luxury villas. The project would reroute the small river and shut down the local art program that the teenagers loved. The villagers were scared, but felt powerless. They had no money, no influence, and no one who would listen. Sandra felt her chest tighten. She glanced at Keanu, who had gone still, his jaw set in quiet determination. "We can't let that happen," she said. Keanu nodded. "But we need more than just outrage. We need a plan." They gathered the villagers in the small community hall that afternoon. The room was crowded, the walls lined with murals painted by children over the years. The teenagers who had been arguing the day before stood at the back, their faces tense. Sandra stood at the front, her voice steady but warm. "Stories can change hearts," she said. "But action can change futures. We have to fight for this place." A man in the crowd shook his head. "They won't listen to us. They only listen to money." "Then we show them something they can't ignore," Keanu replied. His calm voice carried a quiet strength. They spent hours brainstorming ideas, fundraisers, petitions, outreach to local news outlets. The teenagers suggested creating a short video about the village's history and the art program's importance. Sandra agreed and offered to narrate, while Keanu volunteered to film and edit using his own equipment. As the meeting ended, the sky outside darkened. A storm was brewing again, clouds rolling in from the sea. Sandra felt a flicker of fear. Storms had taken so much from this place before. That evening, as the first drops of rain began to fall, the teenagers and volunteers worked under the community hall's flickering lights to record interviews. One boy, no older than 15, stood nervously in front of the camera. "Art is how we remember who we are," he said softly. "Don't take that away." Keanu watched through the viewfinder, his throat tightening. He knew what it felt like to cling to something small and beautiful in a world that could be cruel. Meanwhile, Sandra stepped outside for a moment of air. The rain was steady now, soaking her hair and jacket. She tilted her head back, letting the cold drops run down her face. In the distance, she saw headlights approaching, a black car that did not belong to anyone in the village. It pulled up to the hall and two men in expensive suits stepped out. "Ms. Bullock," one of them said smoothly. "Mr. Reeves, we heard you were here. We represent the development company." Keanu stepped outside, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "You're here to convince them to give up their land," he said. "We're here to make them an offer they can't refuse," the man corrected. "Progress is coming. You can't stop it." Sandra felt a surge of anger. "Progress isn't destroying what matters," she replied. "It's building without forgetting." The men exchanged glances but didn't answer. They handed over a folder, a formal proposal, and walked back to their car, their tires splashing through puddles as they drove away. Inside the hall, Sandra and Keanu showed the villagers the folder. The offer was generous on paper, but accepting it would mean losing the art program and rerouting the river. The room fell silent. A teenage girl spoke up. "My mom says maybe we should take the money. We don't have much." Sandra knelt beside her. "Money can build walls," she said softly. "But kindness and memories build homes. This place is more than land. It's hope." The storm outside grew stronger, thunder rumbling across the sky. Keanu stood and said quietly, "We're going to fight this. Not with anger, with heart." They worked late into the night. Sandra wrote a heartfelt speech about the village's history. Keanu stayed up editing footage, his tired eyes focused on every frame. The teenagers painted banners under the dim glow of lanterns. "Every drop matters. Art saves lives. And this village is our story." By dawn, the storm had passed. The air was clean and bright, but the challenge ahead still loomed. The development company would return with lawyers and contracts. But now the villagers had something stronger than signatures. They had a community united by kindness. As Sandra stood by the ocean, watching the sunrise turn the water gold, she felt a spark of hope. She thought of the boy's drawing, of the nurse's trembling hands, of the old man whispering gratitude in the hospital bed. She realized this fight wasn't just about a village. It was about protecting the unseen threads of kindness that held people together. Keanu joined her, the early light catching in his hair. "We're not alone," he said quietly. Sandra nodded. "We never were." Far out at sea, a wave rolled toward the shore. Not a storm, but a gentle, steady promise that even the smallest ripples could carry change. And though the battle ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, they were ready to face it together. The village woke to the sound of waves rolling gently against the shore. But inside every home, a quiet tension lingered. Whispers of the development company's threat had spread overnight. Some villagers, clutching the offer papers, wondered if giving up the land might mean safety. Others felt anger boiling under their calm faces. In the middle of this fragile balance stood Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, two outsiders who now felt the weight of a community on their shoulders. Before the sun had fully risen, Keanu was already outside, stacking chairs and preparing the hall for another meeting. The teenagers were helping too, their painted banners drying against the walls. Sandra stood by the doorway, reading the speech she had written the night before, her hands trembling slightly. Suddenly, a small voice broke the quiet. It was the boy who had given her the drawing. "Ms. Bullock," he said, "my brother says maybe they're right. Maybe art doesn't matter." Sandra crouched down to meet his eyes. "Art matters," she whispered, "because it reminds us who we are. When storms destroy everything else, memories and kindness remain." The boy nodded, clutching her sleeve for reassurance. The meeting began as villagers filed in, their faces etched with uncertainty. Sandra stood at the front, her heart pounding. She started to speak, her voice steady but warm. "I know fear can feel louder than hope," she said. "But fear builds walls. Hope builds bridges." She spoke of the nurse whose story had inspired their series, of the night kindness had come alive, of the quiet strength of this village. Keanu played the video they had created. The screen flickered to life, showing images of the storm's aftermath, the rebuilding, the laughter of children with paint on their hands. The teenagers' voices narrated the story. This is not just a village. This is a heartbeat. This is art. This is us. When the video ended, the room was silent. A tear slipped down the cheek of one of the older men who had been skeptical the night before. Just then, the development company representatives entered without warning. Their suits were pressed, their smiles polite but firm. "We gave you a fair offer," one of them said smoothly. "Think of your families. Think of security." Keanu stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "Security isn't about money. It's about knowing who you are when storms come." The representative scoffed lightly. "Emotions won't stop progress." Sandra took a step closer, her eyes shining. "Then maybe you don't understand what progress is. Progress is remembering the hands that built this place. Progress is a child's drawing that says kindness matters. Progress is not forgetting the people whose stories make us human." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A woman from the back, one of the quietest villagers, spoke up. "You talk about money," she said to the representatives, But money didn't stand in the rain handing out food. These two did. She pointed at Sandra and Keanu. And our neighbors did. This land is more than numbers on a page. The room filled with soft applause, hesitant at first, then stronger. The representatives' confident expressions faltered. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters as if the village itself was speaking. As the meeting broke, the villagers gathered in small groups, whispering plans. Sandra and Keanu walked to the shoreline, the sky above them painted with streaks of silver and gray. "Do you think we can really stop them?" Sandra asked quietly. Keanu looked out at the horizon. "Maybe, maybe not. But we can show them what matters. And sometimes, that's enough to change a heart." That evening, they organized a small gathering on the beach. Lanterns glowed softly, casting warm circles of light on the sand. The villagers brought food, music, and stories. The teenagers set up an easel with a large blank canvas. One by one, people dipped their hands in paint and pressed them onto the canvas, an unspoken vow that they stood together. The boy, who had once doubted art, stepped forward shyly. He dipped his small hand in blue paint and placed it in the center of the canvas. "For my brother," he whispered. Sandra felt her eyes sting with tears. Keanu placed his hand next to the boy's, their palms leaving a mark side by side. As the night deepened, music filled the air. An older villager played a simple tune on a guitar, and the children danced barefoot in the sand. The ocean waves kept time, gentle and steady. Sandra leaned her head against Keanu's shoulder for a moment, letting herself feel the warmth of community, the fragile beauty of this fight. But then, just as laughter reached its peak, headlights swept across the beach. The representatives had returned, but this time they were not alone. A woman stepped out of the car, a lawyer for the company, her face unreadable. She held a folder and walked toward them. "We have a new proposal," she said, her tone measured. "But you'll need to meet with the board tomorrow." Keanu studied her face. Why the sudden change? The lawyer glanced at the lanterns, the canvas covered in handprints, the children's laughter. Something in her expression softened, though she tried to hide it. "Let's just say, some hearts are harder to ignore than we thought." The villagers exchanged hopeful looks. Sandra felt a flicker of possibility spark in her chest. After the lawyer left, Keanu turned to Sandra, his voice low. "Did you see that? The way she looked at the canvas?" "Stories heal," Sandra whispered, repeating the words she had seen painted on the community hall wall. They stayed on the beach long after the lanterns burned low, watching the stars appear one by one. The ocean stretched out before them, vast, uncertain, and beautiful. And in the darkness beyond the waves, something waited, a final test that would decide not just the fate of a village, but the meaning of every quiet promise they had ever made. A gray dawn stretched over the coastline, the sky heavy with low clouds that seemed to hold their breath. Sandra Bullock stood outside the community hall, the folder with the development company's new proposal clutched to her chest. Her stomach felt tight, like the air before a storm. Beside her, Keanu Reeves adjusted his jacket, his calm presence a steady anchor against the anxiety swirling inside her. Today would decide the village's fate. Villagers gathered quietly, their faces drawn but hopeful. The teenagers who had painted banners the night before stood together, their hands still stained with bright colors. The boy, who had once doubted art, held his brother's hand, his small fingers gripping tightly. As they drove toward the nearby city where the meeting would take place, the mood in the car was solemn. Sandra stared out the window, her mind replaying every step that had led them here. The screening, the ambulance, the note, the drawing, the storm, and the gathering on the beach. Keanu glanced at her occasionally, offering a small, reassuring smile each time their eyes met. The boardroom of the development company was sleek and impersonal, a stark contrast to the warm, painted walls of the village hall. The representatives sat at a long glass table, their suits crisp, their expressions unreadable. The lawyer who had visited the beach was among them, her gaze softer now but still guarded. Sandra spoke first, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of every story she'd heard in the village. "This isn't just land," she said. "This is where children learned to dream, where neighbors fed each other when storms took everything, where a small drawing kept hope alive for years." Keanu followed, his tone calm but firm. Progress isn't worth it if it erases the people who built the foundation you're standing on. If you destroy the heart of this place, you destroy something you can't buy back. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. She opened her folder and slid a paper forward. "We've amended the proposal," she said. "If the village agrees to a smaller section of land being developed, we'll fund a permanent art program and strengthen the riverbank to protect the homes. We'll also dedicate part of the profit to community projects." A murmur spread through the villagers. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a sign that hearts had been moved. Sandra exchanged a glance with Keanu. Relief flickered in their eyes, tempered by caution. The boy with paint-stained hands stepped forward timidly. "Does that mean we get to keep our school and our art?" he asked. "Yes," the lawyer said quietly, her voice softer than before. The villagers erupted in applause, not loud, but full of gratitude. Sandra felt her eyes sting as Keanu placed a gentle hand on her back. Later, back at the village, the sky cleared. The ocean sparkled under the afternoon sun as children raced along the shore. The canvas of handprints from the night before was nailed to the community hall wall, a permanent reminder of what unity could achieve. As evening fell, they held a celebration on the beach. Lanterns swayed in the breeze, and music drifted across the sand. Villagers shared stories, laughter, and food. A young girl presented Sandra with a new drawing. 3 figures under a rainbow, standing on the shore, surrounded by dozens of smaller figures. In crooked handwriting, the words read, "Because you stayed, we all stayed." Sandra knelt to hug the girl, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Thank you." Keanu stood nearby, speaking quietly with the teenagers about their art program. He showed them how to use driftwood and sea glass to make sculptures. When he looked up and caught Sandra's gaze, they shared a silent understanding. They had done more than save a village. They had reminded themselves why kindness matters. As the stars emerged, the villagers began singing, a simple melody about home, hope, and holding on. Sandra and Keanu joined in, their voices blending with the others, carried away by the gentle ocean breeze. Long after the celebration ended, the two of them stayed by the water's edge. The moon cast a silver path across the waves. Sandra broke the silence. "I was afraid," she admitted softly. "Afraid that stories couldn't change anything." Keanu smiled faintly. "They did. Because you believed enough to tell them." She looked at him, tears glinting in her eyes. "We believed." They stood quietly side by side, watching the waves roll in, a reminder that storms may come and go, but the ties built on kindness and respect endure. In the distance, the rebuilt village glowed warmly under the lanterns, a small but unshakable beacon in a vast, unpredictable world.